we left the circumstance of Jehoshaphat having joined affinity with Ahab, going to the Battle of Ramoth Gilead, and we saw that, sadly, Jehoshaphat compromised God's principles in trying to help Ahab. His motives were good, weren't they? He was trying to help the people in the north. But unfortunately, it's not just motives that count, it's also doing it God's way that is so important, isn't it? And he nearly gets killed in the whole process. The marriage alliance that he made with Ahab almost completely destroys his family. So you'll find that when Jehoram becomes king, he was king in the reading that we just had in 2 Kings chapter 3. But in 2 Chronicles 21 verse 4, when he becomes the king, he goes and kills all his siblings. So that's all of Jehoshaphat's children. This is a consequence of this marriage alliance. And then he has a son, Ahaziah, who's just as evil as he was. And then when Ahaziah dies, as you probably know, Athaliah, who was Jezebel's daughter and married to Jehoram, she decides she's going to be queen, and she kills all her grandchildren, Jehoshaphat's great-grandchildren. What a disaster. The consequences of making this mistake in joining affinity with Ahab were huge for his family, weren't they? And they were huge for the nation as well. It's an important lesson to realise, isn't it? So, just recapping on the timing of all this, which we talked about briefly on Saturday night. So the reign of Jehoshaphat begins in the 4th year of Ahab. The Battle of Ramoth Gilead is in the 17th year of Jehoshaphat. We saw that in the 11th year of Jehoshaphat, Ahaziah must have been born, because you can work that out from the chronology of when he takes the age he is, when he takes over from Jehoram. He's 22. Jehoram reigns 8 years. Therefore, it's got to be 14 years before. 25 years of Jehoshaphat's reign, less 14, takes you to the 11th year of Jehoshaphat, when Ahaziah is born, which means that the marriage alliance took place at least the year before, the 10th year. And we also said that it's no coincidence that the contest on Mount Carmel with Elijah versus the prophets of Baal happened the year before that, and that's 8 years before. Now, I've got a slide here just to prove those 8 years. I'm not expecting to work through that tonight, but if you want to look at the slide later on, you can work through it all, and here's all the items in 1 Kings 19 through 22 that give you the 8 years. I've averaged it out because I couldn't narrow it down more than 7.5 to 8.5. So that's pretty approximate to what it is. Okay, tonight we come to another alliance that Jehoshaphat made. It's sad again, isn't it? Jehoshaphat made 4 alliances with Israel. He seems to have had a weakness for making alliances. There was firstly the marriage alliance with Ahab, and I think that triggered all the rest. Because you see, once he's got a family connection, when Ahab says, I want you to come to battle with me to Ramoth Gilead, it's very hard to say no, isn't it? Because he's got Ahab's daughter in his court saying, you need to go and help Dad. You know, this is family. We've got to help him to sort out his problems. Well, then there was the third alliance, which was Ahaziah, which was Ahab's son, who reigned immediately after Ahab. And so let's go to 2 Chronicles chapter 20, and we'll see that there is reference here, brief reference, to this alliance, which wasn't a military alliance. It wasn't a marriage alliance, but it was a commercial alliance. So 2 Chronicles 20, starting at verse 35, and after this did Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, join himself with Ahaziah, king of Israel, who did very wickedly. And he joined himself with him to make ships to go to Tarshish. And they made the ships in Ezion-Geber. Now we'll just pause there. The fact that these ships are made at Ezion-Geber starts to explain why Jehoshaphat might have been interested in helping. Because that's right down the very bottom of the land on the end of the Red Sea, isn't it? This would be a port for Jehoshaphat. Up to now, he's not been able to get down that far. And the reason was because the Edomites were there. As it turns out, and we'll explain shortly, the Edomites became subject to Jehoshaphat. So he had access to a port right down at Ezion-Geber. So it seemed like a really good idea. He could actually have a port access to the sea, and Judah had not had that the whole time that they had been separate from Israel. So, an alliance to go and make ships to go to Tarshish seemed like a good idea because the men of Israel had been making ships for 60 years and using them in the Mediterranean. So it seemed like a good idea, didn't it? However, verse 37, then Eliezer the son of Dodavah of Marashah prophesied against Jehoshaphat. Here's another prophet coming to him, saying, because thou hast joined thyself with Ahaziah, Yahweh hath broken thy works. And the ships were broken, that they were not able to go to Tarshish. So that was the end of that alliance, wasn't it? Another disastrous alliance. And tonight we're going to look at the Jehoram alliance in 2 Kings chapter 3. Now, where do these occur? Back on our timeline, the alliance with Ahaziah to make the ships is only about a year after he went to Ramoth Gilead. The reason we know that is Ahaziah only reigned for a year. So it's got to be within that year, doesn't it? You can't make an alliance with a dead man and achieve very much. So the next alliance, the alliance with Jehoram, or sometimes he's written as Joram, is the next year. We know that for several reasons. The first reason is that the record in 2 Kings chapter 3 is immediately after 2 Kings chapter 2, which is the chapter in which Elisha takes over from Elijah. And that's early in the reign of Jehoram. So that sort of sets the scene. You can see there's alliances happening very fast here, isn't there? So let's look at the story. Well, first of all, let's have a look at a lesson. We all have some weaknesses, and Jehoshaphat's weakness was making alliances, wasn't it? Abraham made the same mistake twice, didn't he? He said Sarah was his sister in Egypt, and then later with the Philistines in Genesis 20. We can be thankful that God doesn't give up on us after our second or third time that we sin. But you've got to remember that God's forgiveness of sin doesn't necessarily wipe away the consequences that flowed. And we see that in the life of Jehoshaphat, that marriage alliance that he made, well-intentioned though it might be, God forgave him of that, as we'll see in our exhortation next Sunday, but he didn't remove the consequences that flowed all the way through for 2 generations and disaster for the nation. But it's an important thing to think about that, well, how should we review the repeated failures of our brethren and sisters? Because we're all people that are frail and that we can sin so easily, aren't we? And we know ourselves that we have repeated failures. Certainly I know I do. And I suspect that most of us do. So we need to be understanding of each other. Now, background to 2 Kings chapter 3. Now, Moab, if we go back to 2 Kings chapter 3, Moab had been tributary to Israel. So in verse 4, we're told, Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep master and rendered unto the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and 100,000 rams with wool. So he's a tributary to Israel. And we also happen to know, and we won't turn this one up, but Edom, down the south of Moab, on the southern side of Moab, was tributary to Judah. And they were actively tributary during Jehoshaphat's time. Now, after Ahab dies, verse 5, when Ahab was dead, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So that's the scene. What also we find out from history is that Moab takes the Israelite territory up to Heshbon. So the Israelite territory is in green, you can see. Moab is down below that bit of green on the right-hand side, and it's this bit that they had taken. So Mesha, the king of Moab, had taken that. How do we know this? Well, because there's a thing called the Moabite Stone, which gives the whole story. And you can go and see it. It's in the Louvre in Paris. And you can see the picture of the Louvre there. And if I only had time, I'd tell you, notice that there's a glass pyramid. That's the entry of how you get into the Louvre Museum. If I only had time, I'd tell you how significant that is biblically. Revelation chapter 11. It's phenomenal. Anyhow, we haven't got time to talk about that tonight. We might talk about it another time. So, what do we learn about the campaigns of Mesha, king of Moab, from the Moabite Stone? Well, here's a map taken from the Macmillan Bible Atlas. And if you haven't got a Macmillan Bible Atlas, it's now called a Carter Bible Atlas, just recently. It is one of the best atlases you can have. It's got maps of all sorts of activities and every event in the Old Testament. It really is amazing. So the map is taken from Macmillan Bible Atlas. So what Mesha records on the Moabite Stone is that he was oppressed by Omri and then Ahab, then rebelled and took the Israelite territory northward, nearly to Heshbon. So that's the same bit that we had marked out on the previous slide. So he's taken this territory. And he also refers to Chemosh as the god of Moab, and that Chemosh had blessed him in being able to take all of this territory from Israel. Now, isn't this amazing? This lines up exactly with the Bible account. Mesha is named as the king of Moab. The territory involved that has been lost can be worked out from Scripture to be this very piece of territory. So it's just another lesson, isn't it, brethren and sisters and young people? Archaeology confirms the Bible facts yet again, time and time and time. Archaeology is our great friend because archaeology proves the facts of the Bible so that we can really trust that this book is accurate, despite all the atheists around that want to try to poke holes in the Bible, try to prove its inaccuracy. Archaeology keeps on providing information that tells us that it is accurate. Now, so that's the situation. And, I've got some notes here that I'm supposed to look at too. So let's go back to the record in verse 7, and we find that verse 6. And King Jehoram went out of Samaria the same time and numbered all Israel. Presumably he came to the conclusion when he numbered them that, we perhaps don't have quite enough men to go and deal with the Moabites. So verse 7, he went and sent to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, saying, the king of Moab hath rebelled against me. Wilt thou go with me against Moab to battle? And Jehoshaphat's now confronted with another request, isn't he? And it must have irked him to think, oh dear, here we go. But what can I do? And so he gives exactly the same answer that he did when Ahab asked him to go to Ramoth Gilead. You can see it's cross-referenced in the margin. I am as thou art, my people as thy people, and my horses are as thy horses. What didn't he do, brethren and sisters? He didn't ask in prayer what he should do, did he? We know that because otherwise Yahweh would have told him not to go, that this was going to be a disaster. And he has to go and seek Yahweh afterwards, doesn't he? So again, we find that failure. And it's a failure all too common in particularly in my life, not praying about things as often as I should. So, why would Jehoram agree with this alliance? I think I've already covered that. I'm getting ahead of myself. Another reason that Jehoshaphat would agree with Jehoram to have an alliance with him, I think, is in verse 2 of this chapter. In the description of Jehoram, it says, he wrought evil in the sight of Yahweh, but not like his father and like his mother. For he put away the image of Baal that his father had made. So imagining it from Jehoshaphat's point of view, he looks to the north and sees, well, this king is actually making some progress. He's better than his father and mother. He's gotten rid of Baal. That was the huge stumbling block. And he sort of acknowledges Yahweh, as we will see later on when in verse 10, when he says, Yahweh hath called these three kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. Well, he's got it all wrong, but he's acknowledging that Yahweh exists, doesn't he? So you might think, well, if you're Jehoshaphat, he's made some progress. He accepts Yahweh's existence. So maybe he can be responsive. Maybe we can work with him. Because after all, he's got this disaster sitting in his own family. It's a time bomb waiting to go off. He'd love to defuse that time bomb, wouldn't he? So working with Israel really is something that he wants to try as a chance to have a godly influence on this new king. Now, also there's a military strategic issue here too. That is an unchecked Moab, and they've already spilled up north, haven't they, is a bit of a risk to Judah as well. Because now that they've gone north of the Dead Sea, they've only just got to go across this way a little, and they're into Judah. So it's a risk for him as well. So off they go. Verse 8. He said, which way shall we go? And he answered, the way through the wilderness of Edom. So Jehoram wants to go that way, which is actually a good choice. Rather than go and take the territory back that they've just lost, which presumably the Moabites be expecting them to do that, you come round behind to the bottom end, to the back of Moab. And you can see the route again. This is from, again, the Millen Bible Atlas. So that's the route they take, and you can see that they start off in Samaria, go down to Jerusalem, they go through the territory of Edom down by the bottom of the Dead Sea, and they come around to the brook Zered, which is quite significant. So, southern route is a surprise strategy. Edom is tributary to Judah, so you can go through Edom's territory. Hence, Jehoshaphat controls all the territory till they get to Moab. That's good. And they come to the brook Zered, which is Wadi el-Hassar. Normally, it just doesn't dry up, even in summer. And of course, this is summertime, because as you know, whenever kings in those days went to war, they started off going to war in early summer. Why do you go to war in summer? Well, it's a whole lot better than in winter, because if you're going to be camping out, as you have to, in winter, and it's raining and it's wet and it's cold, that doesn't help your troops to feel as though they can perform well and do the things you want. So, what does the territory around the brook Zered look like? Well, we've been there. And that's how you can see the beautiful fertile valley that is there round beside the brook Zered. It's pretty hard to even spot a blade of anything living there. It's real desert. Do you think it rains there very much? However, flowing through it is the brook Zered. And it's in a canyon, and this is what it looks like in summer. You can see a tourist there. You can see a trickle of water. Might be enough for quite a few people. And so that's what it looks like. But when they get there, there's no water. And this is the only stream in the area. So what do? Verse 9. And they fetched a compass of 7 days' journey, and there was no water for the host and for the cattle that followed them. Pretty grim, eh? They've gone 7 days, and because they've been going down beside the Dead Sea, there's no water all the way there. So once you've done your 7 days and you've come to the brook Zered and there's no water, you probably won't survive walking back the 7 days to where you've come from. So that's certain death. And if you stay where you are at the brook Zered with no water, well, that's certain death. Or if you then attack Moab, you've got a whole bunch of troops that really are rather thirsty. And are they going to be at peak performance? Probably not. So it looks like you're in a terrible trap, doesn't it? So that's why I think that the king of Israel says, "Alas, Yahweh hath called these three kings together, that we might die in effect." So what does he do? He blames Yahweh. So it's now Jehoshaphat to the rescue, isn't it? But Jehoshaphat said, verse 11, "Is there not here a prophet of Yahweh, that we may inquire of Yahweh by him?" Now you might notice that he's doing the same as he always does. He inquires of Yahweh. The word darash. He's always seeking Yahweh. Whenever he's in trouble, he seeks Yahweh. And that's a great principle for us too, isn't it? Whenever we're in trouble, first thing we do, seek Yahweh. So, notice that in verse 9, it said, "So the king of Israel went, and the king of Judah, and the king of Edom." Now what we find is the king of Israel, verse 10, says something, and verse 11, Jehoshaphat says something, not king of Judah. I don't think he's feeling very kingly, because you find that through the next few verses, there's reference to the kings. And so verse 12, "So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him," that is Elisha. Notice, he doesn't call himself a king anymore. I think he's very humiliated that this has happened all over again. Anyway, he inquires, and there's a servant who knows. Yeah, and one of the king of Israel's servants answered halfway through verse 11 and said, "Here is Elisha, the son of Shaphat, which poured water on the hands of Elijah." Now this is amazing from several dimensions. First of all, this is a servant of the king of Israel, and he knows all about Elisha and Elijah. They were the enemies of Ahab and his family, of course, as we know. And Elisha has only recently become prophet. He's taken over from Elijah. And look where we are here. This is the places of Elisha and the sons of the prophets. This is where the ministry of Elisha is. Now, the bits circled are where there was the sons of the prophets, the schools of the prophets, if you like. The bits the places in red are places that Elisha visited. So notice that's all well above the Dead Sea. And here is Elisha, he's right down at the bottom of the Dead Sea. Is this just coincidental that he happens to be down there? Doesn't seem like something sensible. So what is happening? Well, Yahweh has realised that this Jehoshaphat's going to get himself into a real mess. He's going to be in real trouble, and he needs a prophet right down beside him. Isn't that amazing? Talk about the amazing evidence of providence. Lesson. Elisha's presence is an amazing example of God's providence for the faithful. Psalm 34, verse 7. "The angel of Yahweh encampeth round about them that fear him and delivereth them." You know, if God can do that for Jehoshaphat, despite him making mistakes, he can do it for us too. Because it doesn't say in this quote from the Psalms that the angel of Yahweh encamps round the important people like kings, or the grand people like apostles or priests. No, it says of them that fear him. That includes us, doesn't it? And it's comforting to know, isn't it, brethren and sisters, that the angel of Yahweh is with us. We have angels beside each one of us that go through all our lives with us, right ready to help us. And their readiness is indicated in this example, isn't it? That lo and behold, Elisha happens to be there at the right place and at the right time. So, verse 12. "And Jehoshaphat said, The word of Yahweh is with him," that's with Elisha. Now this is interesting, the next bit. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. Is that the way kings normally do it? If they want some counsel from someone, do they go to see them? No. They say, you come to me. That's what kings do. You come into the king's court. You'll get an invitation at a set time. But you see, these fellas are in trouble, aren't they? They're thirsty. And they know their troops are very thirsty. And their troops could decide to get up and go at any moment because they're on death's door. So they're desperate, aren't they? So they go to Elisha. So, what does Elisha say to them? Verse 13, and Elisha said unto the king of Israel, what have I to do with thee? Get thee to the prophets of thy father, the prophets of thy mother. And then the king of Israel says, he repeats exactly what he said back in verse 10, which is just so stupid. For Yahweh hath called these three kings together to deliver them into the hand of Moab. Now, what's the point of saying that? And you're saying it to a prophet of Yahweh, as if he doesn't know. Well, if he doesn't know, then he's not really a prophet of Yahweh. If he does know, well, then it's probably better to keep your mouth shut and actually ask for some advice instead of making a silly statement again. So this gives us a bit of an index of Jehoram and what he's like. And verse 14, Elisha says, as Yahweh of hosts liveth, before whom I stand. Where have those words been said? Anyone remember? Elijah. And what was the circumstance? Sorry. Yep, with Ahab. Yep, Elijah goes into the court of Ahab to announce the famine. You might remember he goes charging in and just says this. And this is how he starts off. As Yahweh of hosts liveth, before whom I stand, there shall not be rain or whatever. So Elisha says exactly the same thing to him. And of course, those words would have been etched in this boy's brain. Because you see, he was around when Elijah said that to his father. So he'd know about that, wouldn't he? This is an absolute challenge to Jehoram. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about the king's record and about the life of Elisha is that we find it's out of chronological order, hopelessly out of chronological order, but it's in a thematic order. And so 2 Kings chapter 2 and chapter 3 are all about Elisha being given authority by God to rule, to be able to talk to kings and tell them off, to be able to talk to all sorts of people and put them in their box. And the reason is, when you get into a study of Elisha, is that way there is going to be protection for those little schools of the prophets that we saw pictured in those various places. They're still on the screen. To protect them from the evils of Ahab and from Jehoram now, from that whole family who wanted them all dead. So there's a point to be made here, because this is the first encounter of Elisha with Jehoram. So he puts him right back in his box. What can Jehoram do? He can't storm out or threaten him because, well, we need Elisha more than that. We can't threaten to kill him. That's not going to help, is it? So he's caught. So we find that Jehoshaphat, continuing in verse 14, he says, were it not that I regard the presence of Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, I would not look toward thee nor see thee. Then he says something rather strange. But now bring me a minstrel. And it came to pass, when the minstrel played, that the hand of Yahweh came upon him. A minstrel. Why is that? If you look at all the other circumstances of when Elisha gives prophecies, there is no other mention of a minstrel or of music, of anything like that. So why is this the case? I think it's because he's trying to help Jehoshaphat and to educate this man Jehoram about something that's very important. and that is the right attitude to have when you come before God. Because you notice that it's a minstrel that is used. He's playing on a harp, and we know, for example, that the sons of Asaph prophesied with harps, 1 Chronicles 25, verse 1 to 3. So what is it doing? It's showing Jehoram the environment of God's word. This is about godly music, not worldly music. So, for example, why do we have hymns at our meetings? Is it just to praise God? Is it just because it's a tradition and, well, we just do it? Well, really, it's about conditioning, isn't it? Hymns are a very important part because they stir our hearts to godly thoughts and godly emotions. Now, this is not a time to go right through all of the effects of music, but it's a well-known effect, isn't it, that music can have upon all of us, is it can stir emotions. It can change our mindset. It can make us more sympathetic to something or less sympathetic to something. It can relax us. You know, Brahms' Lullaby. My watch sometimes plays that to me at 10:30 at night to tell me to go to bed. Why choose Brahms' Lullaby? Because it settles you down, doesn't it? It's nice and soft and it winds you down nicely. So what hymns are about is to provide the right thoughts and the right emotions when we come before our God to worship. But you see, young people particularly, you need to be aware that when we have things that aren't hymns, we need to make sure that there is still that effect, that the music isn't actually in contrast to what the words are saying. Because it's not just the words that count, it's the music as well. And music needs to stir the emotions in the right way. And if it's really worldly music, but with some words that are godly, you've got a clash. It's not really going to work properly. It's not what God wants. So just be aware, young people, that there is that risk. Now, next interesting thing, very interesting thing. After the minstrel is played, the hand of Yahweh comes upon Elisha, and he says, verse 16, "Thus saith Yahweh, make this valley full of ditches. For thus saith Yahweh, you shall not see wind, neither shall see rain, but yet the valley shall be filled with water that you may drink, both ye and your cattle and your beasts." Now, this is a miracle, isn't it? God can do any miracle he wants. He could provide them with water and make the stream flow again, as in the Brook Zeewet. They're right there. That's where they are. He can make that just flow. Why do they have to dig ditches? Well, the water's going to come from a different direction, and they're going to need ditches to capture the water as it goes whoosh past. Yep, there's a good practical reason for it. But I think there's also a very good reason that is a spiritual reason. They had to do something for their own deliverance. It wasn't as though God was just going to provide this, oh, here's the water, now off you go. No, they had to work for it. They had to do something for it. And I think there's an important lesson here in terms of our salvation. We need to work for our salvation. There are many examples of, for example, in the parables in Matthew 25, of the parables of the talents. And the one talent man that didn't do anything didn't get very far, did he? It was the others that had the bigger number of talents and actually did something with their talents that were rewarded. And, you know, sometimes we hear the doctrine being propounded that we are saved by grace. And that's true, isn't it, brethren and sisters? We are saved by grace. We cannot earn our own salvation. However, one of the classic quotes that is used by those that want to run this line, that we are saved by grace and grace alone, or sometimes it'll be by faith and faith alone. That's not true. So if you come with me to Ephesians chapter 2, in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 8, this is the classic quote. Verse 7 for connection, that in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace in his kindness toward us through Christ Jesus. For by grace ye are saved through faith. So there it is. And that not of yourself, it is the gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. And I don't know how many times that's been quoted to me by those that are in the saved by faith and faith alone category. But there's a problem. They're not reading the very next verse. Because the very next verse says, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. In other words, we should do good works. So it's not a case of works have no place at all in salvation. It's a response to faith and grace, isn't it? That's what is being said in Ephesians chapter 2. So this principle is being outlined to the people that were there with Jehoram and Jehoshaphat. We need to work for our salvation. They had to dig and dig and dig ditches. And it must have seemed to the troops that this was just a waste of time. No sign of rain, and we're going to dig ditches. We're already thirsty, nearly dead, and you want us to do this sort of job? But they had to. Now, there was the promise of victory and the promise of rain, and it did come. Back in 2 Kings chapter 3 and verse 20, and it came to pass in the morning when the meat offering was offered. Notice when it happens? When the meat offering is offered. That's one of the critical times in the day. You remember there was the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice. This happens at the time of the morning sacrifice. It's also the time when the lamps are lit again, refreshed, attended to in the tabernacle, aren't they, in the temple. It's a critical time. Anyway, at that time, then there behold, there came water by the way of Edom, and the country was filled with water. Now, this is not unusual in the Middle East. In fact, around that area, this is how a flash flood can happen. You might have a dry riverbed like this. Now, this is taken down in the Negev, which is in the south part of Israel, where it's pretty barren. And I wasn't sure that I could actually play a video here with an internet connection, so I've just taken a picture. But there's a video, you can look it up on the internet, flash flood in the Negev, and you'll find it on YouTube, where it looks all dry, and then just in the distance you can just see something moving, and then it gets closer, and it looks like this. Just this heap of water comes whoosh right through. Not just a little trickle and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, just comes whoosh right through. You can see the people are here, and the video is quite entertaining because they're busily taking pictures and some of them get wet and they have to scurry off. It's really quite good. So it happened. The water did come. It did come. Now, verse 21. And when all the Moabites heard that the kings would come to fight against them, they gathered all that were able to put on armour and upward and stood in the border. So they're right ready. They rose up early in the morning, verse 22, and the sun shone upon the water, and the Moabites saw the water on the other side as red as blood. You think, wow, that's a miracle, isn't it? But you know, there is precedence in this. And here's an example where the water turned to look like blood. And this is quite recent. It's only about 10 years ago. This happened in a place called Camage in France in August 2012. And it was due to some high levels of natural salt in the water. And when you looked on it, it was red. And normally it wasn't. It was an unusual temporary phenomena. So you can see how God uses natural things to actually create the circumstances that he wanted. And of course, they saw it's as red as blood. Whoa! Goodness me. Looks like, and as they say, verse 23, the kings are surely slain, they've smitten one another. Now therefore Moab to the spoil. So they come charging out, totally unprepared for battle. When they get to the camp of Israel, Israel smites them in verse 24, and they fled before them. And then Israel not only got to deal with the Moabites like that, they were able to, verse 25, they beat down the cities, so they went to all the other cities. On every piece of land, they cast stones, so that was ruining the pastures, etc. They felled all the good trees. Only in Kir-Hareseth they left the stones thereof. Now, we then come to the end of the story. And the end of the story is in verse 26, when they come to Kir-Hareseth. Now that was right down the bottom, it was near the brook Zered, right down the bottom of the Dead Sea. And it's a natural fortress, is Kir-Hareseth. It's actually got Kerak Castle on this place now, and that was put there by the Crusaders in the 12th century. So you can see it sitting up on the hill. You can see how steep the hill is that it's on, and it's exactly the same place as Kir-Hareseth, which was the capital of the Moabites. So what happens here is Israel have gone right around and with Jehoshaphat gone through the rest of Moab, made a mess of the place so that the Moabites are disadvantaged, and then they come back to the capital, Kir-Hareseth. They're not going to do that first because it's a hard place to take. So they're settling down to take Kir-Hareseth. And verse 26, and when the king of Moab saw that the battle was too sore for him, even with Kir-Hareseth, he took him 700 men that drew swords to break through unto the king of Edom, but they could not. Why is he trying to do that? Well, you see, the Edomites and the Moabites had been good friends for years. And this is, well, if ever as the king of Moab, you need a good friend, you need it right now, don't you? But unfortunately, the king of Edom is now committed to Jehoshaphat. But maybe if you went to appeal to him, he might change sides. And in fact, the king of Edom did revolt once Jehoshaphat was dead and sided with the Moabites. And that's the story for Sunday afternoon, which is really thrilling. So he tried to break through, couldn't. And so what does he do? He takes his eldest son and offers him as a burnt offering upon the wall. Now, if you imagine that there's someone up on the wall on the top of this place here, I mean, on the edge of the wall, you'd be still visible, wouldn't you, to the people right down on the ground. And he's obviously making a big deal of this, that he's going to offer his son as a burnt offering. And I mean, if we were there, we would revolt at that, wouldn't we? We'd see this son, who's probably a grown man at that point, being killed by his father on the top of the wall as a show for everyone to see. And it worked, didn't it? There was great indignation against Israel, and you can imagine those in Israel be saying, whoa, this is terrible. Let's get out of here. We've done enough damage to the Moabites, let's get out. And so they departed and went from him, that is from the king of Moab, and returned to their own land. And that's sort of the end of the story. But think about it, brothers and sisters. What would it be like for Jehoram going home? Oops. Sorry, I'm just having trouble getting the slides to advance the right way. So Jehoram heads home. He's got a long ride, hasn't he? Because he's going right from down the bottom of the Dead Sea all the way up to Samaria. So he's got about, 170 kilometres, something like that, which is not that far in a car, but when you're on a horse or in a chariot, it's quite a way. And just imagine him thinking about this. Time to think. Would he realise that Yahweh had reached out to him? He'd have to remember that he nearly died of thirst. And Yahweh had dried up the wadi, because the wadi normally had water in it. So it was exceptional that it didn't. So this was something that Yahweh had done. Yet miraculously, the prophet Elisha happens to be there to help him out. And miraculously, the prophecy of water comes true. And miraculously, they had victory over Moab. Hadn't Yahweh proved himself? What more could Yahweh do? And the question for Jehoram is, would he seek after Yahweh and forsake idolatry? Is this going to be the big change in his life? The burning question is, what am I going to say to Mum? Because Mum is Jezebel. Is she going to be convinced of this? When Ahab came back to Jezebel at Jezreel and said, look, the prophets of Baal have all been killed. There was 400 of them. Sorry about that. She was not impressed, was she? She threatened Elijah. So was she going to take it lying down this time? Probably not. He'd have to be very, very determined, wouldn't he? Would he in fact do that? The sad answer was he didn't. He chose the path of idolatry and died a violent death at the hands of Jehu. You know, brethren and sisters and young people, God proves his existence to us in creation and world events and sometimes in our lives. But we notice that God never forces us to believe in him. God will never do that. He provides plenty of evidence, plenty of things that prove his existence and his willingness to help us, but he will never actually force us to believe in him, will he? Because he wants volunteers. He doesn't want pressed men. He wants people that will voluntarily do his will, voluntarily love him. That's what he's wanting, isn't he? And that's why, of course, Jehoram couldn't quite get to that, cross that hurdle. He was perhaps thinking that God was going to force him to acknowledge him. But no, that's not the way God works. Well, Jehoshaphat heads home too. And I think he'd be having a lot of thinking, a lot of soul searching. He's got a big ride home, not as big as the one that Jehoram has. He'd nearly died of thirst together with the rest of them. God had graciously saved him again. This wasn't the first time, was it? He'd think back to the time when, well, he was out fighting the Syrians, and the Syrians were chasing him hard, and it looked as though they were going to get him. And he cries to Yahweh, and Yahweh saves him. God had graciously saved him yet again. But very serious consequences were coming out of this. Although pretty serious consequences flowed from what he did with Ahab, there's also serious consequences coming from this. But that is, of course, the subject of our next study. So, some lessons, some summaries. Jehoshaphat has a character weakness, doesn't he? He makes alliances with Jehoram to fight Moab after a rebuke for his Ahab alliance. It's a lesson for us, isn't it? We've got to strive to not repeat the same sins. I don't know about you, but I know that in my life I have weak spots, and I have done the same sin several times. You know, it takes a lot of resolve to say, I've got to make sure that I don't do this again. Incident. When there was no water, he's ready to admit that he can't solve his own problems. Something important for us to do, isn't it? To be ready to admit we can't solve our problems and we need Yahweh. Incident. Yahweh saved him from his folly, but not from the consequences that follow. And Yahweh will be gracious to us, and despite our failings, if our heart is true, but there can be consequences. And I think I've hammered that several times. Sorry, I hit the wrong button then. Yahweh saved Jehoram and gave him opportunity to embrace Yahweh. Let's be aware of Yahweh acting in our lives and be responsive to his direction for us. Thank you.